Thank you all. Thank you for having me. As Stefan said, I am a treasure hunter. And I realize that that probably sounds very romantic and somewhat adventurous and kind of exciting. And it is all of those things. But the one thing that I've learned about treasure hunting that is applicable to all walks of life is that more than anything, it's about perseverance. And so I'm here today to kind of talk to you a little bit about perseverance. But first I want to take you back 300 years to Spain in the year 1700. King George II was on his deathbed, and he had no natural children, no heirs of his own. So he nominated his nephew, 16-year-old Philip, to succeed him as monarch and king of Spain. Now this created a bit of a problem throughout Europe because Philip was the grandson of Louis XIV, king of Spain. And so the idea of such a strong Bourbon dynasty within Europe created great consternation for England and the Dutch. And so consequently, they launched the War of Spanish Succession. This War of Spanish Succession was a 14-year battle that took tremendous toll on young Philip, which he was forced to endure. There was a tremendous loss of life and great debt that accrued throughout this war. Yet Philip persevered in his belief that the Bourbon dynasty should indeed rule Spain, which it still does to this day. So ultimately the war was settled in 1714 by the Treaty of Utrecht. And once the war was then settled, Philip was able to send his ships, his treasure galleons, to the New World, where hundreds of tons of treasure had been amassing down in in South America and in Mexico. Now, Philip couldn't afford to send these ships during wartime for fear that they would be captured or sunk by the British or the Dutch. So, with the treaty now in place, he said, "Come hell or high water, get down and bring me my treasures," which he so sorely needed. So 6 ships went to South America, 5 ships went to Mexico. They loaded up these treasures that had been amassing for almost 10 years. And they finally reconvened in Havana in July of 1715. Now, once these ships were re-provisioned and readied for their trip back to Spain, they finally ultimately departed Havana on July 24th of 1715. 6 days into their journey, they were sailing along the east coast of Spain when a storm began to brew on the horizon. And Don Ubilla, the admiral or general of the fleet, knew that these ships were in trouble. And his only course of salvation was to tell the crews to batten down their hatches and head for the shore, because the only chance of survival they had would be on that beach. The crews reluctantly did so. The passengers, they were panic-stricken, and ultimately by 2 a.m. on July 31st, all 11 ships were lost. Now you can imagine being stranded on the desolate beaches of eastern Florida and what these people had to endure. Of the 2,500 people that were on the ships, the crew and passengers, 1,500 survived. And they were faced with tremendous drought and starvation. But ultimately, the hierarchy of the ships took place, and they actually began to form a small society whereby they all worked with each other to provision the camp and sustain each other. And in fact, they even salvaged some of the treasure. And due to their perseverance, most of them had returned to Spain by 1716. So now I'd like to fast forward 250 years and introduce you to a gentleman named Kip Wagner. Kip was a construction contractor that moved to East Florida to work on a hotel. And one of his favorite pastimes was walking the beaches of Florida. And while doing so, he began to find these metal objects on the beach that were black in nature and somewhat resembled an Oreo cookie, if you're familiar with that. He gathered these coins and took them home and began to clean them. And what he ultimately realized is that they were silver coins, Spanish in origin. And he began to wonder, why are these coins on our beaches? And so he asked around, and a lot of the locals said, yeah, people have been finding those for years. They find gold coins from time to time as well. But no one truly had an explanation as to why these coins were there. So Kip began to do some research. And that research ultimately led him to the archives in Washington, D.C., where he found a map that was made by an English cartographer named Bernard Romans in the year 1780. And on that map, there's an interesting notation next to the Sebastian River, which is where Kip lived. And that notation says, opposite this river perished the admiral commanding the 1715 plate fleet. And it was then that Kip knew what he had found. It was the remains of the 1715 plate fleet. So Kip got himself a surplus army mine detector left over from the Korean War, because there were no metal detectors back then. And he began hunting the beaches, and he found more and more of these coins and different artifacts. And it ultimately led him to an area surrounded with Spanish artifacts around a freshwater well that Kip determined had to have been made by the survivors of these shipwrecks. And so, because that well was there, he knew out in front of him must be one of these wrecks. And so he got himself a surfboard, and he cut a hole in that surfboard, and he put a little window in it. And he began to paddle around in the ocean, looking for any evidence of a lost shipwreck. And after a couple of weeks, he saw cannons. And once he saw those cannons, he knew this was it. He was responsible for the finding of hundreds of millions of dollars in lost silver and gold that had been long forgotten about. They recovered every artifact that you could possibly imagine from life on a ship in that period. The tools, the silverware was made of silver, the plates were silver, there was jewelry, there were cannons, cannonballs, muskets, musket balls, everything that you can possibly imagine. And thus, modern treasure hunting was born in the United States. So now I'd like to fast forward you to 2010. My father and we purchased the exclusive salvage rights to the remains of the 1715 treasure fleet from the heirs of world-famous treasure hunter Mel Fisher. And 17 days after we bought these rights, we found the cannon that you see there with 50 gold coins and 40 silver coins hidden inside of it. And I can be honest, I thought, this stuff's pretty easy. I think I'm going to enjoy this. Little did I know what it was really about. And in 2011 and 2012, we found some amazing artifacts, but we certainly didn't find anything that was going to pay our bills. And in 2013, I experienced one of the single worst days of my life. One of my divers drowned while searching for this treasure. And it was the most horrific day of my life for not only me, but my whole entire crew. And it caused us all to reassess what were we doing out there. And one of my crew members quit. He didn't want to do it anymore. And I had to ask myself that very difficult question. Why am I doing this? Am I doing it for lost gold and silver? And I realized no, that wasn't the case, and it certainly wasn't something that I was willing to lose my life for. But what I did come to was the conclusion that I had given my father a commitment to see this through to the end, no matter what happened. And if I were to happen to lose my life in pursuit of this, in honor of that commitment, I was okay with that. So ultimately, my crew and I got back together, and we went back to work. And basically what it is that we do is we excavate the sand. What you see in the pictures behind me are what we call mailboxes or blowers. They're large aluminum tubes that we swing down over the propeller of the boat. And then we use the thrust of the water to excavate the sand, because all of these artifacts are buried under anywhere from 5 to 10 feet of sand. You can imagine when you stand ankle deep in the water, after a minute or two you start to sink. And it's the same principle with all of these artifacts. So we go out and we excavate the sand and we swim down with a metal detector, and we find something in every hole. Usually what we find is beer cans. Beer cans, lead fishing sinkers, all sorts of modern debris and garbage. But occasionally, things can go right. And when they do, it kind of makes things worthwhile, because in the United States, we have a very famous saying. It's the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, yet expecting different results. And that's exactly what we do every day when we go out there and we excavate these holes. We're hoping for something other than beer cans. And this summer, on July 30th and 31st, you may remember those days, the actual 300th anniversary of the sinking of these Spanish galleons, my crew and I found 300 gold coins worth approximately $4.5 million. The centerpiece of these coins were perfect specimens of coinage called royals, and they were made for King Philip V himself to be given out as presentation pieces. And so basically, I'm here to tell you that if you follow your dreams and you believe in oneself and you have unending perseverance, magical things can happen. And here's a little video of some of the magical things that happened to me this summer. As you can see, we're extremely close to the beach. We found this in about 6 feet of water, which people are always amazed by. And so we've excavated that sand away, and underneath in the bedrock, you'll see the cracks, and obviously, these cracks were just filled with gold. The bottom was literally paved with gold coins. Those are my crew members. Here's one of those royals that I had described, a perfect specimen. This coin that you're going to see brought up is worth $350,000. The best part of it for me, to be honest with you, was to experience this with my crew and see the joy on their faces, knowing that they were going to share in this, because they work strictly for a percentage of the treasure we find. They don't get a salary. They come because they have this passion for finding these lost artifacts. There were people gathered on the beach, and the celebration was quite tremendous, to say the least. There's another one of those royals. You wouldn't be able to think that you could actually speak or scream through those regulators, but it does happen. So basically, that's my story, and I very much appreciate your time.